Today I'm going to be showing you step by step how I painted this scene. This is one of my favorite landscapes that I painted this last year. I'm going to talk through the values and the timing and exactly how I created this scene in watercolor. Well, you probably know what I'm going to say before I say it, but the first thing that I do is I lay out my drawing and then I wet down the back of my paper and the front of my paper with a sponge. Now, it might look like I'm just absolutely soaking this paper because there's some water on my drafting table here, but I'm really just getting it damp on the front and the back. And what that does is it just gives me more time to work wet into wet before the paper dries. This scene has a few tricky parts to it. One is there's these sheep in the foreground that have a really light value to them. So what I'm going to need to do is to paint the grass around them and negatively paint them. So I'm dropping in some light value, some raw sienna right now. I didn't want to just leave them the white of the paper. I felt like that contrast would be a little too stark. I wanted them to have some warmth on them that reflects the light of the scene. Now I'm going to go ahead and paint the sky and other things, so by the time I get down to where the sheep are, it'll be dry enough I can paint around them. So I'm starting with the sky. I put a little bit of warmth in the sky, and that's some rose madder permanent, a little bit of lavender and raw sienna, and then I'm coming in with some cerulean, and at the very top, some cobalt blue. So I'm really darkening up the sky near the top and letting it fade and warm as we get near the horizon. Now you'll notice that sometimes I get little hairs left on my paper, and I know that drives some people crazy, and sometimes it can create an issue, but what I found is most of the time I just leave them there, and then once the paper dries, I can just blow them off at the end and it's no big deal. I laid in some light tone for these hills in the background. They are going to be more in middle value, but when I go back and paint them again, I want to be able to leave a little bit of that first wash behind, and that'll create some more richness in that wash. There are some light colored houses in the background, and I didn't stress about these too much. I didn't want to have to paint around every single one, so I'm leaving some highlights, and I'll go back and I'll lift some of that out if I need to, some of that green that's around them. This green I'm using now is a little more muted. It's Cobalt Turquoise and raw sienna. That's my main green mixture. And as I get closer down to the middle ground and foreground, I'm going to add some more cadmium yellow. And what that does is it helps add some saturation and a more vibrant green for that part of the painting. What that does is it allows that middle ground and foreground to become more important and to come closer to us, because remember, saturation and warmth, they tend to bring things forward. If you cool things down, that tends to push them back. As I get down into the middle ground and the foreground, I'm adding a more rich green to my painting. Now what I'm doing here is laying in some light tone for this building. I know a lot of it's going to be in middle value, but again, I'm setting myself up for the next wash because I don't know what exact areas I might want to leave behind. And so by adding some of that warm color for the stone now, it gives me more options when I paint in my middle value. I can paint around areas, or I can cover up most of it and just leave a few little highlights of that first original wash. And what I'm using for that is more raw sienna and lavender to kind of neutralize that raw sienna and give it more of that less saturated stone look. There's an interesting little barn down here, or shed, I'm not sure what you call it, this little building here, and I wanted to paint around that and give that little area some interest. So that's why I'm painting around that area for now. Now I'm back to green. So I have more of a saturated green that I had mentioned before, more cadmium yellow into my green mixture of cobalt turquoise and raw sienna, and adding that bit of cadmium yellow gives me a bit of richness in these greens here that are closer to us. And you're going to love this later on when I struggle with this main sheep, just trying to get the form right. I'm sure some of you can relate to that, but that's coming up later in the video. I'm adding in some of that color for the stone again here. And now I'm painting around my sheep and bringing that color of green all the way down. So we're getting close to being done with our first wash. When I do the first wash, I like to connect some of the shadow parts of whatever it is I'm painting into the first wash. I don't really like things to just look completely cut out of the painting. So I'm always looking for ways to tie whatever it is, if it's a sheep, a person, a car, a building, a tree, to tie that into each wash. That creates more of a unified feeling in your painting. And this is what the painting looks like when it's all dried and we're ready to move into the next phase. And what I'm starting with over here is this distant hill. And again, it might look a little cooler than it does in the reference photo. I want that hill to sit back in the painting. And I'm starting off with more of a cooler gray color, and I'm taking my time getting the shape of the hill right, playing around with that. And this is the phase of the painting where we want to really think about connections. What values are similar enough that we can just paint from one right into the other? And using that approach, we can really create a more unified shape for the painting, which makes it a lot stronger visually. So that background is a little bit of cobalt blue with raw sienna and some lavender. And you'll notice that as I'm moving closer, I'm warming up that wash using more raw sienna to bring those areas forward. I'm connecting the value of this building into the value of the hill. So those shapes can run right into each other. When you're looking at this in the photo, you can see, well, that building is so much stronger than the distant hill and it needs to feel closer. And that's true, but that will come with the darks. I'm still in my middle values and I want to connect that hill right into the side of this building. I can come back later and get that separation that's needed to really bring that building forward. Continuing over, now I have the hill connected right into the building. And as I work down closer to the buildings, I'm using more pigment and I'm adding more green onto my brush, more of that cobalt turquoise and raw sienna, really increasing the value as I get closer and closer in the scene. And I'm finding ways to connect these houses and buildings right into this wash as well. And you'll notice the roof and other little shadow areas of the building I paint right as I'm painting the background hill. And there are some hedgerows and trees and bushes and other things that are all connected that I'm working on now. Always looking for those connections. And you'll see as I increase the value, which means I'm using more paint and it's a stronger mark, this is really starting to come forward. And that hill is sitting nice in the background. And while that background hill is damp, I went ahead and added a few marks to show the trees kind of receding into the distance. And so that's an example of wet into wet in the middle of the large connected shape. And now I'm adding some darks. I went ahead and moved ahead on that. Sometimes I'll wait till the end of the painting, but I don't mind if some of the darks kind of melt into this shape as well. So I'm adding some darks around some of the trees. I want some soft edges on that. And I went ahead and added a little bit of dark here on the side of this church. And for the dark in the trees, I'm using some neutral tint along with my green mixture of cobalt turquoise and raw sienna. And this is neutral tint with raw sienna and some lavender. And now I'm adding the top part of the church, which is pretty key, and a few more little darks on the building. I wanted the trees and the shadow of the dark part of the building to just kind of melt together. And now there are some dark on the stone wall, some other little bits that I can connect into this larger wash. Always finding ways to tie every wash into each other. That's very helpful in creating a more unified painting, is finding those little bits that can connect back into that larger wash. Now I'm working on this closer up stone wall, doing the same thing, adding a few more middle value and dark bits to give that more texture. And I'm back up here working on the church spire, moving around, adding little bits of detail and darks on the stone. And I wanted to tie in the texture on the grass. I knew I would need more texture in the foreground. What this is going to do is connect some of this into the value of the fence, and then it's also going to allow me to negatively paint around the sheep, which is going to really help them stand out in the scene. So I'm dry brushing some of this. And again, texture brings areas forward. And so adding some more texture into the middle ground and foreground is really going to help that area come forward in the painting. And this is what I'm talking about leaving some of the first wash behind. So by using some dry brush and adding some texture over the top of this, that green wash that we painted early on in the scene, that plays an important role because I'm leaving some of that behind and it's helping me create that texture here. And I'm doing the same thing I did in the first wash. Notice I'm connecting the shadow side of the sheep, the lower part of the sheep where they're darker, right into this middle value wash. I'll say it again, every time I'm creating a wash, I'm always looking for ways to tie in all the objects in the scene into this wash when possible. You know, that's not a hard and fast rule for everything that you paint, but I think it's a nice touch when you're painting this way to make everything feel like it belongs together and not so cut out. So a few little darks for some windows and some detail on the church. That was a prominent area of the scene that I really wanted to include and highlight. A few windows. And once you get the darks in and these details, that's when the light in the scene really starts to become evident. A few little darks and marks on the stone wall to give that the texture that it needs. And now I'm taking on the harder part of the scene, and that is finishing up these sheep. It really took me a while to get a handle on these. So here I have some gouache on my brush. The role that gouache plays in my paintings is if there's little highlights around the scene that I'm just unable to get by painting around, and I need some white to break up areas, add a little detail. See, you get a few little marks here, and all of a sudden this really makes sense. The light is more evident, you know where to look in the painting, and that's what gouache is for. I don't use it to block out large parts of the painting, just little highlights. And here I am back fiddling with these sheep again. I'm really in a battle here to make this look like a sheep. And I used some gouache to get some highlights back, and I felt like it needed a little more dark around the sheep to emphasize that area of the painting, adding some more texture on the church. I used some dry brush for that. Raw sienna, lavender, just a simple gray mixture. And now I'm back with some gouache, messing with the sheep again. And eventually I got it to a point that I found acceptable, and here is a look at the final painting. And I really like how this painting turned out. I had so much fun painting this, and I hope that this look at my step-by-step process and some of the things I struggle with along the way can really help you take on scenes that are a challenge for you as well. It's always good to keep pushing forward and to keep growing. Have you ever been really excited about a painting and you get all set up, you find that right reference that you're excited about, and then it's time to go and you feel lost? I have a free resource that I want to give to you today that can help with these problems. My 5 steps to plan a successful watercolor painting. I walk you through the crucial planning phase of your painting that will help you understand what you're going to paint first, second, and third. The planning is really so important, especially in watercolor. This medium is harder to correct. It's so immediate. So having that plan is very important. I send you a PDF that you can download. And the great thing about this is you can have it on your phone, you could print it out, and you can take a look at these crucial planning steps before you start each painting. All you have to do is follow this link here and download my 5-step guide to planning a successful watercolor painting.